Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is going to be a kickoff, if you will, of a series which will be about whether Paul was a Roman agent. But technically, the title of this episode in the series is number one: Did Paul's power to kill Christians after Jesus' crucifixion come from the Roman power? In other words, we know Paul admits that he was a killer and a murderer of Christians before he had his experience on the road to Damascus. Then the next sub-question, specifically, did this power come from Herod Antipas, also known as Herod the Tetrarch? Now, we're going to have a bonus issue in this episode. Was Paul a friend from childhood of Herod Antipas? We'll see. That's actually mentioned in Acts 13:1. Let me just give you a little background about Herod Antipas. He died after 39 AD in Gallia. No one knows exactly when, so you can't pin it down. Herod Antipas was a ruler who came from Herod the Great. That was his father, and he died around 3-4 BC and was succeeded by Agrippa the First. So after him came Agrippa. And he was also known as Herod the Tetrarch. The word tetra is a prefix meaning four, and then arch means a ruler. He was one of the four rulers of Judea, so he's sometimes called Herod the Tetrarch. And fortunately, not many other usages of that are applied to any of the other three, so we don't get confused. But he's also known in history as the Herod Antipas. All right, so let's begin. Now, let's start with the first question. Did Paul's power to kill post-crucifixion of Jesus come from Roman power? Well, how do we know that who was allowed to authorize death penalties in the area of Judea? Could it be the Sanhedrin? Was he operating under their authority? The answer is no. This is even mentioned in John 18:31. Pilate said to the authorities from the Jewish people, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." They answered, "But we have no right to execute anyone." They objected. So they acknowledged they don't have the right or power to kill anyone, so we want to have him killed, and therefore we want you to do it. So they're not wanting to take over the responsibility of trying Jesus. Now, we're going to go into a sub-issue, which is, was Paul raised with Herod the Tetrarch? So I just want to go back and remind you, our questions are, did Paul's power to kill Christians come specifically from Herod Antipas, also known as Herod the Tetrarch? Now, if Paul was a childhood friend of Herod Antipas, also known as Herod the Tetrarch, that could explain a lot, why he had this power in the first place. Let's take a look. Now, in Acts 13:1, we're looking at the King James Version. That's fine. The King James Bible added a comma here. There is no punctuation in Greek. It's scripta continua. There is no punctuation, even spaces between words. So none of that is how you determine what the meaning of the sentence is. And as my old instructors taught me, you have to read it out loud. And that's still the principle that you can find online explaining the only way to translate Greek properly is you have to say it out loud. You have to read it and out loud so you can see the syntax. Let's listen. Now, there was in the church that was in Antioch certain prophets and teachers as Barnabas and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So it's very clear, Manaen was brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So these three men were all childhood friends. Okay? Now, I just want to show you, even a Catholic scholar brought this up. Saul Paul is grouped with those raised with Herod Antipas the Tetrarch. Now there, and he just says the same thing I went and just recorded there. And I'll just leave it there for the moment, okay? Now, I want to explain to you about scripta continua so nobody can claim they don't understand what I'm saying here. In an article called Greek Languages and Linguistics, it explains, in addition, the ancient Greeks used no spaces between words or paragraphs. The texts were a continuous string of letters with an occasional blank line inserted to mark the end of a major section, though even this was not always done. They also had no equivalent to our lowercase letters. That means there's no punctuation here, and the only way to understand this sentence is you have to say it out loud, and don't allow someone to influence you by adding commas where they don't belong, okay? Okay, and so just to remind ourselves that these people who were agitating for the death of Christ included the high priest, included the Sanhedrin. These people had no power to kill Jesus, and that's what even they said back to Pilate when he didn't want to take the case. They wanted a death penalty. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." but we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. That means the high priest had none of the powers of killing anyone, neither the Sanhedrin. So they had to depend on the Romans. I'm going to give you now what I would call indirect proof of the same premise. Here's 4 proofs that the Sanhedrin was basically trying to manipulate Pilate to take the case because they couldn't kill him. Okay, so now watch all the evidence. 1, they were plotting to have Jesus murdered. That's mentioned in John 11, 47, 53. So they're trying to do it on their own, just kill him off the cuff, but that's not going to work. 2, they paid Judas Iscariot 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus, Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16, and so on and so forth. So they're trying to get him in a position where they can kill him, but they don't get. They're not going to try to do it judicially, by the way. So they're never trying to take him into court and address it that way where a death penalty would occur, because they know they can't. So they're trying to actually kill him. 3, they had Jesus arrested and tried Jesus using false witnesses to accuse Jesus. And here's the citations. So there you have it. They were definitely manipulating the legal system to get him convicted under Roman law so that then they could kill him. 4, they pressured Pontius Pilate into having him crucified. That was one of their demands. Now, we're going to see there's some counter evidence that the real person who wanted Jesus crucified was not just them, but most importantly, Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, the ruler of Galilee. Now, I want to read you something about the Gospel of Peter, and I want to go in a little bit into a digression here, but first, let me just tell you what is the point of this. Herod Antipas, also known as the Tetrarch, meaning the 4th ruler, one of 4, the 4 sons who were the children of Herod were ruling the Judea at one point, or initially after his death. He sends Jesus back to Pontius Pilate with a mock crown of thorns and blood dripping on a mock royal robe. In the Gospel of Peter, Peter alludes to orders by this Herod intended to kill Jesus before the fact. What is this gospel? So there's what looks very much like a addendum to the original gospel, and it's actually appears to be related to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and we'll get into that later. So this goes back to the earliest point in time, and there's scholars who defend this, and I think it is legitimate because there's nothing very controversial about this text, except it points a stronger finger at Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, who I've already shown you, he was raised with Paul. Now, let's continue. What is the Gospel of Peter? The Gospel of Peter is a very short work. It's 15, 18 verses. It is part of a small book that was discovered in the Egyptian desert by French archaeologists in 1886 or 1887. The book was written at the end of the 6th century, but the text itself dates back to the second half of the 2nd century. So that'd be the late 100s. But it really doesn't sound that way. It sounds like it belongs in the original earliest text, and even scholars defend that, and we'll show you that reference later. Now, let me just tell you a little bit more, that this is a work that was quoted in the earliest church. The Gospel of Peter was recovered in 1886 by the French archaeologist Urbain Bourrin in the modern Egyptian city of Akhmim, near Nag Hammadi. The 8th or 9th century manuscript had been respectfully buried with an Egyptian monk. The fragmentary Gospel of Peter was the first non-canonical gospel to have been rediscovered. Now, see, they always say non-canonical because it's not canonical now, but it was treated as authority in the early church, or at least the language that we're seeing here, that it gave more explanation of who was behind the murder of Jesus. Publication delayed by Warren until 1892, and so forth. Now, this work is summarized by a famous scholar, German scholar named Harnack, and he basically gives this as one of its key points. Herod was the judge who condemned Jesus. So the real person who's making the decisions is really Herod Antipas, and he's just using Pilate as his tool. And to him, application had to be made for the body. So when you wanted to get the body, when it was all over, Pontius Pilate wasn't in charge of that. It was Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch. So we'll get into the exact quotes right here, okay? But that's the main point Harnack saw in this. So that's in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 9, 1912 at 4. Now this is from the same book, Ante-Nicene Fathers, but it's page 7. Okay, here's the quote. But of the Jews, none washed his hands. This is the first verse of the gospel. So you have to understand, this is not a true, like Gospel of Matthew with a heading. It has no headers. There was no reference, but people recognized it fit this message that many had in a canonical reference to a work. It was accepted as authority in the earliest church that they called the Gospel of Peter. This is Peter's testimony of some additional facts of what happened at the crucifixion and the who was behind it all. But of the Jews none washed his hands, neither Herod nor any of his judges. And when they had refused to wash them, Pilate rose up. And then Herod the king commanded that the Lord be taken, saying to them, what things soever I command you to do unto him, do. So in other words, Pilate is working at the behest of Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, the boyhood, childhood friend of Paul. Okay? That's important. Next verse, 2. And there was standing there Joseph, the friend of Pilate and of the Lord. And I thought that was interesting. Remember, Pilate's wife doesn't want him to kill Jesus because she had a dream and so on. And now there's a person named Joseph who's a friend of Pilate and of Jesus. There's a go-between between the two of them. So I think the softness of Pilate even tells you that somebody has to say something above and beyond that he has to follow, that he's not wanting really to do what he's told to do. Continuing, and knowing that they were about to crucify him, he came to Pilate, this is Joseph, and asked the body of the Lord for burial. And Pilate sent to Herod and asked his body. So he's got to ask Herod for Jesus' body. Did you ever think about the burial of Jesus and behind the stone? Who was self-interested? Who was taking the troops and putting them outside to make sure absolutely this Messiah could not come back, and they were going to be able to, bury the Christian movement with the death of Jesus, right? It had to be Herod Antipas because he's the ruler of 1/4 of the kingdom and the kingdom of Galilee where Jesus grew up, right? So if he were to become a Messiah, he'd probably have to start there. So this is a person self-interested for his own power. This is Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee. He's the one who would want to have a motivation to kill Jesus. Pilate's just a low-functioning magistrate. And Herod said, Brother Pilate, even if no one had asked for him, we purposed to bury him. So he's explaining why I have taken the body of Jesus, especially as the Sabbath draws on, for it is written in the law that the sun set not upon one that has been put to death. And just so you know, Herod Antipas keeps up all this, the myth that Herodians always did is, we're trying to follow Jewish law, but they're murderers and killers. They're not nice people. Okay, so anyway, you can see this is basically the main point of the Gospel of Peter that you can extract today is there was something different that we didn't see is who was behind the control of the murder of Jesus and who had all the political motivation to do so, who put pressure on Pontius Pilate to do so, and how the body had to be controlled by that same person because he wanted to make sure he would never come back to life. Now, the reason why people call this the Gospel of Peter is because it actually is subscribed or said to be written by Peter. So it has in verse 14 of the 15 verses, but I, Simon Peter, and Andrew, my brother, took out our nets and went to the sea. So this is first person account by Peter. And it kind of makes sense because remember, Peter would stand outside places and listen in and keep track of things that are going on officially. So what did he hear? We all know of his shame for having denied Christ 3 times, but what did he hear before that stopped? There was some message he picked up, and these are the inferences that you can make. He was learning what's going on behind the scenes, and that was what his agenda was. Now, let me show you how the Gospel of Peter lines up with the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, the earliest Gospel. Ron Cameron and others have further speculated the Gospel of Peter was written independently of the Synoptic Gospels, using an early proto-gospel. A consequence of this is the potential existence of a source text that formed the basis of the Passion narratives in Matthew, Luke, and Mark. And that should be the what Justin Martyr called the Memoirs of the Apostles, what others call the original Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew written to the Hebrews, as well as in Peter. Origen makes mention of the Gospel of Peter as agreeing with the tradition of the Hebrews, meaning the Gospel to the Hebrews. The relationship to the Gospel according to the Hebrews becomes more clear when Theodoret states that the Nazarenes, that's a successor name or parallel name to the Ebionites, made use of the Gospel of Peter, for it's known by the testimony of the fathers generally that the Nazarene Gospel was commonly called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So again, Here you have the earliest text, Gospel to the Hebrews, which, by the way, was existing into the 800s. It was listed in the Eastern Orthodox as part of their canon, and they had even the line numbers counted, so they would know how many, how to fit it into their Bibles. So they had to do line counting, and so they could fit it in and make room. So this was a book that was still revered into the 600s, 700s. Somehow it's all disappeared. Why? We don't know. Nobody's ever investigated why it went out of history after it was even preserved that long in time. Except it was not obviously Trinitarian, just so you know. The same gospel was in use among the Ebionites, and in fact, as almost all critics are agreed, the gospel according to the Hebrews, under various names such as the gospel according to Peter, according to the apostles, the Nazarenes, Ebionites, Egyptians, was substantially the same work, circulated very widely throughout the early church, though with modifications. So what you're really hearing is this work that's called the Gospel of Peter actually belongs to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So it's an actual discovery of a section of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And it's just very objective, very neutral, if you ask me. It just happens to tell us something more that we couldn't see before, that it was Herod Antipas who took all the interest in the body of Christ and wanted to protect that from not coming back to haunt it. In other words, we got to get it buried. We're going to take it. And that's who took the body, in other words. All right, so now we're going to go back to Acts 13:1 again. Just listen again. What's the connection between Herod the Tetrarch, the guy who's controlling the body of Christ, who was pushing Pilate to get him executed and killed? Now there was in the church, Acts 13, verse 1, that was at Antioch, certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So Saul, was on equal footing with Manaen and Herod the Tetrarch as friends from birth, from a childhood, from the earliest part of their lives. So when Paul says, "Greet my relative, my kinsman, Herodion, son of Herod," is what that means literally in Greek. That's in I think it's Romans 16:34. He is admitting and acknowledging a person at Rome before he got there was his relative, who was a son of Herod, which Herod the Tetrarch is a son of Herod. Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, could have been visiting Rome at the time he was writing the letter. And by the way, it was very common when you're a ruler of a part of a section of the Roman Empire, you would be called into Rome very frequently to report on the status of things. That was actually your job. You had to then take directives from the emperor and then go back and execute. All right, so I think I've covered this already. Now, what about Paul's authorization to kill a man like Stephen? Okay, so we know that the book of Acts mentions in Acts 7 that Paul, here it is, 7:54, the stoning of Stephen. Paul is obviously relaying this story to Luke. Luke was not present, obviously, and Paul is involved in having the death of Stephen. Now, the question is, did he authorize it? Was he the one who had to authorize it? And we're going to actually see the word used here, Luke says, is authorized it, allowed it. Okay, so this is very key to pick up on, and very much wanting to be suppressed by Christian scholars, that you don't know the word is meaning allowed or authorized. Okay, so we're going to look at it carefully. Sometimes it's translated as approved or was in agreement, right? But we're going to show you what it really means. All right, so we're going to focus on the underlying word here, synodokeo, in a second. Acts 7, verse 54, beginning there, the stoning of Stephen. When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. And then it has a whole story of what happened. And Saul approved their killing of him. Saul approved the Sanhedrin of killing Stephen. As we've already seen, the Sanhedrin has no power to kill anyone. There had to be someone present who would authorize them to do this, who would have the power of Herod Antipas, Herod Tetrarch, or the emperor to kill Stephen. And if that person wasn't present and authorizing it, it wouldn't have happened, because they would all be killed for violating the law that you are not allowed to execute anyone without the authorization of Rome. That's how it works. You have to go through correct channels. Rome was very it abided by strict legal principles so that there would not be chaos. They're very much an organized country. Anyway, so Saul approved is how the NIV translates it. Saul was in agreement with his execution, but we're going to see it has its stronger meaning than just those words. So I'm going to show you the underlying word is syneduco. Okay. The better translation is he allowed it. He authorized it. This is Luke 11:48 in a different context using the same word. That's how it's translated. Let me just show you this. See, Saul was allowing this execution. That is better. Let's take a look at the same word being used in Luke 11:48. Truly, you bear witness that you allow the deeds of your fathers. That word there, allow, see over here, is syneduco over here in Mouncy on Luke 11:48. So that word syneduco is translated by the KJV as allow, but not in this passage. It's used differently, or it's translated differently as approved or in agreement. But if it's allowed, that means it's before the fact. He's authorizing it, and then they're allowed to proceed. And if he didn't permit it, it would never have happened. All right, now, if you look up that word synedoke, you would get some reference to the metany and metonymy over here in the figure of speech. But if you go down to its actual meaning as a word, the term is derived from the ancient Greek word synodoke, simultaneous understanding. So there was a simultaneous understanding between Paul and the people doing the acts and the criminal acts. So he had to have already agreed for them to do it. That's the simultaneous aspect of it. And now let me read you some commentators that basically dig deeper here and tell you what I'm saying. Expositor's Greek, Acts 8:1. The word is also found in these passages, signifying entire approval. So it's not just an approval after the fact, it's full throttle approval. And that's just giving a little clue. It is also used twice by St. Clement, and it gives a reference to that. Now he says this: the consent does not express the force of the words. If it says he consented to what they did, the expositor is saying no, that does not express the force of the word. Instead, he was approving of his death. That's correct. So approving, authorizing, same thing. Allowing, like Luke 11:28. That's what he's doing. He's the key man. He's the decision maker that you can do this or not do this. Now, here's Ellicott. Saul was consenting unto his death. So they're going to say, no, that doesn't work. What it really means is he was guiding and directing the murder. So again, why can't they just say flat out, he authorized the killing of Stephen? Because that's embarrassing. See? So instead of telling you he allowed it, he authorized it, they have to just go through games. And what all these scholars are trying to tell you, the way it's translated either is consenting or, allow or approved. These don't even come close to understanding he's the decision maker. He's the guy deciding it can be done. He's authorizing it. He's allowing it because he has that power. Paul had the power. He had the power of Rome to decide who could live and who could be killed. All right, so that ends this episode. So let's look at the questions we asked. Did Paul's power to kill Christians after Jesus' crucifixion come from Roman power? Yes. Only the Romans could kill people. The high priest couldn't kill somebody. They even had to go to get Jesus killed. They had to go get Pilate to do it. Same thing with the Sanhedrin. They couldn't kill Jesus. They had to go to Pilate to get it done. So these groups were powerless. Who held the power? Herod the Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, same person who sent Jesus back from being referred by Pilate to himself, being the ruler of Galilee. He was looking at Jesus and he basically had him mocked and scourged, and basically had his the crown of thorns put on his blood. I mean, obviously he said and did more than what was said in what we see in the Synoptic Gospels, and that's the missing link that we find in what's called now the Gospel of Peter, which is actually really a section of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that kind of got dropped out or lost. Maybe because it's undermines Herodian power, or Herodian authority, and maybe points right back at who Paul really is. He is a Herodian agent serving that message, and that's why he has the power to kill. So let's move on. Specifically, did Paul's power come from Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch? And the answer to that is most likely because he was raised with him. They were, blood. His kinsman Herodion, son of Herod, had to likely be Herod the Tetrarch. That's his kinsman. He's related to Herod the Tetrarch. That's why he was raised with him as a child, and with Manaen and Herod the Tetrarch. That's in Acts 13:1. So the answer is we have another. This is one of many proofs, not just the only proof, but one of many proofs that Paul was a Roman agent exercising Roman power when he was prior to Damascus Road. So he is not a low-level person. He's a high-level person working closely in touch with the guy, Herod Antipas, who treated the mission against Christ seriously enough to make sure that Pilate got the message and that he's going to take control of the body of Christ. He's going to make sure he's protected inside of the tomb. He's going to put him in the tomb. He's going to put guards out there so he can't escape, and he can't come back. That was his goal, and that's why Peter wrote what he did and added that to the Gospel of Matthew. That's the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and that's what we're uncovering here. So little by little, as history is allowed to come forth, God, I believe, has miraculously saved little scraps of paper that actually have a lot of meaning, and that included the Gospel of Peter. Helps us get that more rounded understanding of the role of Herod Antipas, aka Herod the Tetrarch, at the crucifixion, for the crucifixion of Jesus in the first place, and then his removal of his body. It was his decision to move it into the tomb. He was the one setting it all up. All right, God bless. Hope that helps everybody. We're going to keep doing small sections on whether Paul was a Roman agent, and this is just one of a series. So this is actually going to be the first. All right, God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.